Hello, welcome to a very windy and wild UK. We're in the throes of what would be considered probably within this country to be a minor hurricane at the moment, and it's causing a lot of damage. A lot of our fences are already down and everything else as well. And I know from people that have been contacting me on Facebook that there seems to be a problem right across the UK with this, so not good. But in terms of today's guests, Dia informs me that they're waist deep in snow over there in Colorado. And I'm not sure with my guest James, but he's down there in Colombia. And I'm sure that the weather, I'm sure he hasn't got snow, and probably it's unlikely that they've got rain as well. But anyway, I've been looking forward to this show for an awful long time. The reason being that James Oroc is one of those kind of men of mystery who I've admired for so long. I've known of his work for a great deal of many, many years now. And this book he wrote, Tryptamine Palace, which we'll be talking about today, is extraordinary. It is an absolutely extraordinary book in terms of the science, in terms of the narrative of the story and everything else as well. And I know that James has slightly a reputation of a man of mystery in terms of those of us that are interested in entheogens as well, because he seems to sort of flit in and out of existence, and people wonder where he is and where he's gone. So I'm absolutely delighted to be involved. Now, a little bit about James's background. I'll be reading from his bio, so if it doesn't look like I'm being particularly automatic, so be it. But James Oroc is an author and an entheogenic philosopher originally from New Zealand, whose books include Tryptamine Palace, 5-MeO-DMT, and the Sonarian Desert Toad, the first book written about that unique compound, and the new psychedelic revolution. His recent examination of contemporary visionary culture and art. An accomplished adventure sports journalist and photographer, he's currently ranked in the top 200 in the world of the sport of paragliding. So again, this suggests that here's somebody that's a very, very interesting guy. Now, I posted earlier on Facebook and on Instagram a really strange coincidence, because I was quite frustrated in that I've got a copy of Tryptamine Palace and I've also got a copy of his new Psychedelic Revolution, and I was hoping to have both copies here to show you. But unfortunately, it's on my Kindle. So I went down to my library to look to see if I could find James's book down there when I hadn't realized it was on Kindle. And I've got literally thousands of books down there. And suddenly my eyes were just gravitated towards this book here, which is the edited book by Daniel Pinchbeck and Ken Jordan, exploring the edge realms of consciousness. And I just found myself automatically opening the pages. And I suddenly find on page 11, there is a chapter by James Oroc, Into the Quantum Realm. And I thought, wow, what's the chances of this? But we all know, as Deirdre and I discussed, that these things happen all the time. So without further ado, James, welcome to the Anthony Peake Consciousness Hour.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
Okay, it's wonderful to have you involved and everything else as well. I'm so looking forward to this. Right, okay. Now, as I understand it, it's around about a decade since the publication of this book. And it was one of the first books I know that under the unique properties of 5-methoxy-DMT. And you were the first guy to really start writing about this. I know there's been a previous guest on the show, Dr. Ball, and I know he's been touching on it as well, but you're very much the man in many ways in terms of this. And it's become a cult classic over the years. Now, were you surprised by the reception the book got? I mean, it's been a cult book. It's been incredibly well received, and it was fascinating to read, and its popularity is unbelievable, and its reputation goes before it. Can you tell us a little bit about the book, and were you surprised by it? Was that your intention?
Well, the irony is it's actually a book I thought would never get published. I was working on a novel at the time that I had the idea of writing it, and I thought, well, that's a terrible idea. Who's going to publish a book about unknown psychedelic and mysticism? But fortunately, I was a member of the Burning Man community pretty heavily at that time, the arts festival in Nevada, and one of the, especially in the 90s and the early 2000s, one of the real driving forces was this concept of gifting, that you're gifting this art, and you know, the art was built without any names attached to it. There'd be these amazing sculptures and things, and you wouldn't really know who built them. They were a gift from the artist to the community. So I had the idea that I would gift a book. So I actually wrote Tryptamine Palace quite specifically sort of as a gift to give away at Burning Man. And for 2 years, I gifted about 500 copies, 250 each year, and just kept working on it. And then some of the psychedelic elders convinced me it was good enough to self-publish. So I was like, all right, if they think it's good enough. So I did some work with John Hanna, who's used to publish the Entheogenic Review and is one of the crew at Aotearoa. Really amazing fact checker, and a guy that really helped me make the book much less new agey or airy-fairy, I think. And then, so we got all ready for self-publication. And I've always hated the idea of being rejected by publishers. So I was like, all right, you got to toughen up. So I sent 2 copies in to 2 publishers to get rejected, strictly just to get used to getting rejected. And to my astonishment, Inner Traditions, who published Irvin Laszlo and Sheldrake and a bunch of my heroes, they accepted it, which was completely unheard of. And, you know, you talk about synchronicities. John Graham, who's the acquisitions editor for Inner Traditions, I sent these Burning Man books that I'd already published, you know, these weird looking Burning Man volumes with a toad on the front, and instead of a manuscript. And one of these landed on John's desk the day before he was going on holiday. So he was like, oh, what's this weird Burning Man book? I'll take it with me. And he read it on the beach, and he's the reason I even exist as a writer today. So
that is incredible, because you're probably unaware of the fact that my first book, when it came out, it literally landed on the desk of the owner of this publisher. And I, rather like yourself, you know, the whole idea of somebody rejecting your manuscript is so awful that I tried a few publishers, but it never really happened for me. And then my manuscript ended up on the desk of the owner of this publishing company in London. And he just needed something to read on the plane, grabbed it as he left the office, picked it up, read it on the plane. And by the time he arrived in New York, he was sending a message back, we've got to get this book. It's absolutely wonderful. So coincidence there. And of course, we are actually both published by well, I suppose it's Park Street Press, those guys, in the book I wrote with Irvin Laszlo a few years ago. So we share that, and they're great publishers, and very, very important, I think, in our field. But before we move on with that, can you tell us a little bit about the whole Burning Man thing? You know, because it's something I've always been intrigued by, because it seems like an amazing event.
Well, Burning Man's constantly changing, so it's pretty hard to pin it down. I feel very fortunate I got to experience the 20 years of it that I have. It's changed a lot. What it is now to what it used to be is a lot different. And I think my interest in it's starting to wane. We'll see. For the best period, the best 15 years, it was really a community. And it was really about, I think it was the roots and the ties that community's made and that have gone all around the world have really been what's been quite astonishing. Once it gained so much popularity that the ticket things become a lottery, and it's very difficult for people to get the tickets to start with. And it's become more of a bucket list thing for people, where they come once and they don't necessarily come again. You know, that radically altered the experiment that Burning Man is, you know. But yeah, for me, it's really been a community based, like, it was the place where I've learned the most about community and about working together and what community can achieve. So for those of us that were there, especially through the 2000s, it was a pretty amazing experience in community building.
Yeah, I feel I've missed out slightly on the great times of that, you know, sort of.
Well, the thing is, if you go, it's still amazing. And that's why I never tell people not to go, because as a spectacle and as an art museum and everything else, it's well worth the experience if you get the chance. And there are still the remnants of that community that kind of hold the whole thing together. But I mean, it's a lot. I mean, there was at one point where I couldn't walk 15 feet on the playa without bumping into somebody I knew. It was crazy.
Yeah, we have something similar over here. You probably know something called Breaking Convention, which happens every 2 years at the University of Greenwich.
Yeah, I keep waiting for an invite.
Oh, they've got to get you. I'll speak to David Luke about this, because they have to have you there. You're absolutely the man. You know, I find it absolutely incredible that you've not been invited. Leave that with me. Leave that with me. I'll try and make that happen for you. Right. So just moving on then. 5-MeO-DMT. Tell us about it, and tell us the unique, strange link it has with Cenarian desert toad. What is 5-MeO-DMT?
Well, I mean, when I wrote it, Tryptamine Palace, I wrote it because there was absolutely almost no information out there about it. And people had the misconception it was DMT, which from a dosage viewpoint is quite dangerous if you don't know what you're messing around with. 5-methoxy-DMT is a cousin to DMT. It's the same molecule with an extra oxygen molecule attached, which for some reason makes it incredibly more potent. And I mean, when I describe the difference between DMT and 5-MeO-DMT in my talks, I lean on a conversation I had with Nick Sand, the inventor of Orange Sunshine LSD, and also the guy that figured out that we could smoke and figured out how to freebase DMT, which he's less famous for. And he would call DMT the fullness and 5-methoxy-DMT the emptiness. And in my lecture, the way I describe it is in relation to the Kundalini scale of the 6th and the 7th chakras. And the 6th chakra, which to me is the realm of mythology, all the gods and goddesses are present, and all the beauty, all the wonder, all the art, anything that the human consciousness can create is accessible, but there's still a separation between the observer and the object. So you can perceive God, but you're not one with God. Now with 5-methoxy-DMT, that's where that distinction, that's the movement from the 6th to the 7th chakra in the Kundalini. Ramakrishna used to be able to describe the ascent of the Kundalini to his students, but when he went from the 6th to the 7th, he would pass out because the mystical expression was unexpressible. So what happens at the 7th is everything collapses into a singularity. And I think that's the real difference between 5-methoxy-DMT and DMT. People expect a spectacle like you get on DMT, and it's utterly, totally different because it's an actual collapse of perspective into like a unified, singular perspective. And the most amazing thing for me is that you can be consciousness without identity. So you're conscious of this realm entirely, but you have no concept of who you are, where you came from, what your roots are, what your species is, what your planet is. And as soon as you start to look for those answers, you're back in a confused heap on the floor. The re-establishment of the ego is astonishingly rapid.
It's funnily enough, again, somebody who's been a guest on this show in the past mentioned to me that when he took 5-MeO-DMT, he said it was the most extraordinary experience, and he is now still trying to come down from it because he found it so astonishing. And you know, it sort of says a lot in terms of that, doesn't it, as to the peculiarities of this particular substance. But it has a very, very strange source, doesn't it, where you actually get 5-MeO-DMT from. So can you just tell us a little bit about where it comes from?
Well, its natural source is from the Bufo alvarius, a Sonoran desert toad. There's 485 species of Bufo toads in the world, and there's only one that methylates bufotenin to 5-methoxy-DMT, which is the Sonoran desert toad. Why this happens, we have absolutely no idea. It's the only entheogen-producing animal on Earth.
Yes, because this friend of mine, again, Martin Ash, the fantasy writer, he was saying that, and it's intriguing because everybody I've spoken to who has experienced 5-MeO-DMT says the same thing, that it's almost like you become at one with the universe. You know, you suddenly, it's a much more powerful experience than DMT. And that in itself is intriguing.
Except you don't exist anymore.
Yeah, and it always amazes me as to how these are natural substances that are just there, that react with the human brain. to create these extraordinary experiences. You know, it's
well, I think, yeah, the first mystery is, how is it there are compounds in plants and one animal that so mimic serotonin that the blood-brain barrier's molecules willingly transported across the most complex defense system we have. They fit into specialized locks in our brain, modify consciousness, and we figured it out.
Yeah, that in itself, you know, the more you get into this, the more your brain hurts. And, you know,
it's an astonishing mystery.
Oh, totally. And I think, you know, your introductory chapters in Tryptamine Palace are such a wonderful primer for the neurochemical aspects of 5-MeO-DMT and DMT itself as well. And I would strongly suggest anybody, if you want a perfect introduction to exactly how these substances react in the brain, I would say, without exception, James's book is the one to read, because it really does make it incredibly clear. So there's many practitioners of this toad medicine, and they espouse the belief that the ancient sacraments of the Mesoamerican people, what we now call Mexico, is the same kind of lineage as the traditional entheogens like ayahuasca and San Pedro cactus. What's your views on this? Is there any proof that their claims are correct?
No, not really. I mean, for a start, I'm going to state I prefer synthetic, and that I hope that we get a good supply of either synthetic or a plant substitute, because it's the worldwide interest in toad venom is being quite harmful to the populations of the toads in Mexico, as far as we can tell. I can honestly say, when I wrote Tryptamine Palace, I never in my wildest dreams thought toad venom would be being traded around the world at ridiculous prices like it currently is. I mean, literally the Mexican mafia has become involved in the harvesting. Yeah, because there's big money in it.
Yeah.
As soon as there's money involved, that's what happens. Things go downhill.
So I was going to say, so how did you come across it then? How did a guy from New Zealand discover this substance? Did somebody else introduce you to it, or did you hear about it, or did you one day lick a toad and got high? You know,
I ordered the synthetic online.
Right.
And in the late 90s, early 2000s, it was an unscheduled substance. It was so unknown, it slipped through the gaps in the law. So there was a brief period in the end of the 90s and the early 2000s where we had these research chemical companies that were producing all kinds of very interesting, mostly Sasha Shulgin creations that were analogs or legal enough that there was no law against it. And one of them was 5-methoxy-DMT. So a friend of mine, actually a friend of my fiance's at the time, rang her up in a very excited state one night saying he had just smoked DMT. Now, I'd been looking for DMT for years, but it was very elusive all through the 90s and 80s. And so I got in touch with him. I'm like, where do you get the DMT from? And he's like, oh, I ordered it online. I'm like, bullshit. You didn't order any DMT online. He's like, no, look. So he sends me the link. And I'm like, oh, wow, you can order this 5-methoxy. So I immediately ordered some. And then I started doing some research, like any good would-be psychonaut. And the incredible lack of information was strange. Like, there was just so little info on this compound at all, and everything that there was pretty negative. So I immediately knew I was dealing with a different animal and was slightly cautious. And I actually went out to meet this guy on the West Coast, and we went to a thing called the Oregon Country Fair, which is a famous hippie fair on the land of Kenkesi that the Grateful Dead have played at. And it's like, and the actual, like, the lineage of the 60s, hippie movement, that the country fair is like the last bastion, right? So I went to this thing with this guy thinking that we were going to smoke the 5-MeO-DMT in these hallowed grounds of psychedelia, right? And we didn't get in. Like, and there's a day event, and then there's a private night event that you have to have these wristbands for. It's kind of a long story, but we got denied. We didn't get in, right? And the hippies wouldn't have us. So I kind of was like at a low point in psychedelic culture, because I was a huge Ken Kesey fan, and this whole thing had really turned me off. And we went back to Portland, Oregon, and I was with another friend, and he's like, you still got that DMT stuff? I'm like, yeah, let's do some, you know. And like I say in the book, in Tryptamine Palace, I expected to be like a cross between a bong hit and acid, you know. And we didn't have the correct scale. I overweighed it. I took the big pile. You know, I probably did close to 35 to 40 mics of synthetic, which is way too much. And, you know, I was out for 40 something minutes, which normally it's like half that, right? My first time was crazy. And I come to in this room, and I'm like, we're in a really plain suburban office in Portland. There's no Ganeshes, there's no nothing, right? And I come to it, I'm standing in the middle of the corner of the room, and I'm waving my arms, doing sun salutations, and there's stuff all around me, like I've come back from another dimension. And I turn around, and the room's been like trashed. Like we had a mattress laid in the middle of the room, and I tried to get under the mattress, and I did a Maori war dance, and I broke some furniture, and before I got to the point where I started shouting, "It's there, it exists, I'm there," you know. And meanwhile, my two buddies have no idea. None of us have smoked this stuff. So they're like cowering in the corner. They're about 2 minutes away from calling 911, wondering when this giant rampaging New Zealander is going to come back to any kind of reality. It must have been quite a scene. I mean, I write about it in Tryptamine Palace, and my buddy a couple of years later is like, yeah, you know, it was much scarier than that, you
know. I can just imagine, because you think, how the hell do you deal with this, you know?
I'm not a small guy.
Yeah, so I'm just thinking of the amount you took. You know, your experience must have been like the experience that that Martin Ash had, as we say in Britain, with balls on. You know, it must have been just so amazing.
Well, there was no chance of resistance.
Really?
And I had no preconception. So in a lot of ways, it was just perfect. I mean, I feel extremely fortunate. I think once a generation, you get the chance to write a book about a new compound that really changes things. One writer every generation really gets that chance. And I was in the right place at the right time with the right skill set. So I would have never written a book about LSD or mushrooms, and I often say, if Ralph Metzner had published The Toad and the Jaguar ahead of my book, I probably would have never written Tryptamine Palace, because it would have felt presumptuous. But because no one had written anything about it, and the elders were kind of keeping it quiet, the reason there was no info was that the groups that were using it didn't want it to be widely known that it was available.
Interesting. So
as it happened, Tryptamine Palace just happened about the same time as the scheduling, and one wasn't involved with the other. So my book was just perfectly timed.
You almost feel as if, you know, it was the universe itself making sure that James Oroc could get this book out at exactly the right time.
No, it was the book making sure it got out.
Yes.
I was just the guy in the middle that had to sit down and do the actual typing.
You know, I feel the same way with my writing. I just feel that it's coming through me. You know, I'm just a faucet that's actually taking these out. And funnily enough, on the Amazon reviews on Tryptamine Palace, as they've actually said, you know, it's 20 books in one. It's an adventure story. It's a deep adventure. It's so many things. But of all the things that are in Tryptamine Palace, what do you think is the most important contribution it has made to psychedelic history?
Well, I think there's two. And I don't think most people actually necessarily get it. Hasn't, neither of them have really hit home like I hope they would. I'd say the first is the actual model I present within the book for how I think we can have a mystical experience with or without psychedelics, but how 5-MeO-DMT works by increasing the coherence in our brain with quantum consciousness, with the holographic information of the 0-point field. And I think I'm one of the few people that actually have presented a model that says, hey, this is the way I think we can have a mystical experience that makes sense within the perimeters of our current, admittedly far reaches of scientific thought. And I think for me, like, if you ask me how has 5-MeO-DMT changed my life, well, for a start, it's completely changed my philosophical, way of looking at the whole world. My actual model of how I think existence and reality and everything else works is completely different to what it was pre-5-methoxy-DMT, where I was a pretty content scientific rationalist, I'd say within the mainstreams of most science. And then my 5-MeO-DMT experiences made me go out looking for other answers. I never thought I'd find one. And that's one of the things that's kind of amazing to me about Tryptamine Palace, is the way a model came together. And I discovered Ervin Laszlo and the whole concept of the 0-point field and all these things that are not, they're not new agey, they're actual they're right on the cutting edge of science. We just haven't quite caught up with it. And in the decade since Tryptamine Palace has come out, those findings have only been supported. I keep waiting for them to be cut down, but my general model only seems to be getting stronger and stronger. You know, so I think that's that's probably my greatest contribution. The other thing that I find a little, a lot of the book focuses in the end on the idea of community building and the idea that we're heading towards a major ecological catastrophe. And that's only got worse. You know, I find it, the whole Greta Thunberg phenomena is interesting to me, because so many people have been saying what she's been saying since the 70s. Just now people are listening to a young girl, a young woman. It's an interesting phenomena. You know, and in Tryptamine Palace, they come up with the term extinction denial. And I don't see that's gotten any less. It's only getting worse. So I think, the whole, where psychedelics is going at the moment disturbs me. The medicalization of psychedelics disturbs me. To me, psychedelics are not about making the paradigm more tolerable by watering them down and using them as some kind of a panacea for depression. LSD reappeared at this crucial time in human history as a tool for us to change the paradigm. It's one of the few tools we got. So, you know, our society has this amazing way of taking things and somehow bringing them back in to its own model. And I see, to me, that's what's going on with psychedelics at the moment. There's no talk of using it for revolution. It's all talk for curing depression, which is a natural result of the ecological catastrophe we're facing.
What a fascinating point. I totally agree with you there. You know, that this is the impression I get as well, and a lot of people I talk to, you know, that what we've got here is a tool for expanding our consciousness and understanding the greater understanding of how the universe works, how consciousness relates to the universe in general. And I'm particularly delighted, you know, to hear, you know, we've both been along a very similar path. I doubt whether you've actually read any of my work. There's no particular reason why you will have done yet. But I've been on a very similar journey to yourself. You know, I've gone down the microtubules route. I'm very, very interested in exactly the 0-point field and the implications of the 0-point field. And indeed, that was when I read Tryptamine Palace. I got so excited about it, and I was so keen to contact you, because I've come from a different direction, but we've actually met at the top. And there's a phrase I use all the time, you know, that there are many paths to the top of the mountain, but the view from the top is still the same. And you and I are very resonating in similar ways.
Well, you can imagine the excitement when I read the paragraph in one of Laszlo's books where he was like, oh, you know, the 0-point field is the source of the psychedelic experience, and rah, 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 and I'm friends with Stanislaus Grof. And I'm just like, you know, I mean, like that hit me out of the blue that he even started talking about psychedelics. I had no clue he was mates with Grof.
Oh, he knows everybody. He's a fascinating guy. I did an event with him down at the University of Milan a few years ago. And it was an amazing discussion. I mean, met people like Gene Houston and various other people. You know, it was really, really good. So in terms of that then, how have you expanded on these theories since the publication of Tryptamine Palace? So you've had a few years to think about these things through. So we both touched upon microtubules. Can you explain a little bit about your take on the whole microtubule model, and maybe to explain again to the listeners and the watchers who may not have come across the whole microtubule argument? Could you explain a little bit about what you mean by microtubules and how they are so important in both our hypotheses about the true nature of reality?
Yeah, I mean, for starters, I'm not a physicist, so I'm a complete layman when it comes to these kind of ideas. But I was looking for something that, you know, if you have this idea of a quantum consciousness, that there's an underlying field that co-penetrates everything, and it's holographic in nature, and it carries information. And we are a physical entity that I believe accesses this field. Our consciousness that's where consciousness resides, is we're in this constant interaction with this field of holographic carrying capacity, right? So the question is, how does that information transfer? How do you transfer something from the quantum realm to the physical realm? So then my thought is, at some level, there has to be the space where the physical stops and the quantum starts, the Planck length, right? This connection point exists. So that's when I started looking around a little bit more at that. And then, I think my original introduction to the microtubules would have been through Roger Penrose and Stuart Hamerhoff's theories. I've done a workshop with Hamerhoff. He's an awesome character, and I find his ideas very interesting. And the thing about microtubules is they're some of the smallest things known in size. They're getting down close to the quantum. They're very small, 4 nanometers. And there's as many, everybody knows there's many neurons in the brain as there are stars in the Milky Way. Well, there's as many microtubules in the human body as there are stars in the entire known universe. Something crazy like that. So on the scale, they're an incredibly complex system that's incredibly small. So my idea is that they're kind of almost like a net that can actually be buffeted by quantum information. And if there's just a small enough movement, this could be converted to a physical chemical reaction. Now, nobody really knows what microtubules are. We just know that there's this incredibly complex scaffolding of these tiny little tubular tubes that runs through all the cells, and especially through the neurons in the brain, right? So Nassim Harriman told me that if you take the cosmic scale, you take from the Planck length, which is the smallest known thing, to the largest known thing in the universe, the human microtubule system is about smack in the center. Now, if you're going to build a computer that was going to appreciate the grandeur of the universe from the very big to the very small, where would it have to sit? Somewhere right near the middle, right? So I think, it's always amazing to me, we moved away from the idea that the Earth was the center of the universe, but I think increasingly we come back to the concept that man is the center of the universe. Like Black Elk said, center is everywhere. And our consciousness is actually creating form outwardly. Like, I really think as we look further and further out in space and our ideas, we're creating these structures. This idea that we're seeing light that was emitted so many millions of years ago and is miraculously coming back to us. What if it's the other way around? What if we're just creating it and pushing it all out with our concept? Maybe maybe at one point the Earth was flat and sat on the back of a tortoise. It doesn't anymore.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, that's very true, because one of the things that you've probably come across the hypothetical work of people like John Archibald Wheeler. And Wheeler, a few years ago, his thought experiment using the twin split experiment to actually argue that quasars that existed billions of years ago are actually brought into existence by the act of observation now, and it sort of back creates the reality. And again,
I totally believe that time can flow both ways that way as well.
Because one of the areas that we're both interested in as well is and you've touched upon this previously, and I'd like you to expand on a little bit more now, is the actual holographic model of reality, as well as to how holographics comes into all this.
Well, I think the basic concept is that the 0 point field, the 0 point field's the hardest thing known to nature, to man. It's actually the densest energetic field. So the old, this is how I describe it in my talks, the old model that the universe of balls floating around in space, or balls on the billiard table, whatever, and whether it's solar systems and galaxies or atoms and molecules is totally incorrect. And the correct way to actually look at the model of the universe is it's a giant block of ice that's honeycombed like Swiss cheese. And all the holes in the block of ice is our physical reality. Because we're actually an imperfection in the perfection of the density of the field, is the way as Einstein described it. So where the field's breaking down into some other thing.
That has interesting implications for Gnosticism, doesn't it? The idea of the concept of the pleroma and the kenoma, and the idea that there is a kind of a purer reality behind us. It's almost moving back to the concept of Plato and the Platonic forms and everything else as well. You know, that
right in line with Vedic thought as well.
Totally. Now, one of the other things that a guy called Michael Pollan has endorsed the idea that psychedelics could be used as a medicine. You've already touched upon this, but can you expand upon the idea of the medicalization of psychedelics and the idea that 5-MeO-DMT could be used as a form of medicine? And if it was, what would it do?
Well, this is, I make a lot of enemies talking about this usually. In the 50s and 60s, a lot of very skillful people tried to use psychedelics as medicines, and it generally didn't work out too well. Now we have this rekindling of interest, and the psychedelic community seems to generally think it's great because they think it's just going to make psychedelics more accessible and more accepted by society if they become medicines. Now, my argument would be this is a medical model. You're talking about doing psychedelics with doctors and clinics and a whole different model to which I really think is the best way to experience psychedelics. And my argument is you don't need medicalization. You need an educated psychedelic community with elders and, rituals in place that people get to discover psychedelics without this idea. To me, they're a sacrament. They're not a medicine. So it's a very different model. I think psychedelics are going for a walk in the forest or in the mountains as much as anything. If you want to feel the source, you're not going to feel the same thing lying in a hospital bed in a clinic with people asking you how you feel every 45 minutes.
Right? That's a very good point.
So you have, and when I first got in, the timing of Tryptamine Palace was really interesting because I kind of came in at the tail end of one psychedelic era and the birth of the next. And my latest book, The New Psychedelic Revolution, maps that change and how contemporary psychedelic culture differs from 60s psychedelic culture. And I've had front row seats for that ride for 15 years.
Well, this is the opportunity. Can you tell us in some detail now? We've got about another 15 minutes left. I'm really keen for now you to drill in for your new book, The New Psychedelic Revolution, and tell the guys out there about it.
Well, the story starts in the early 2000s with the famous bust of the Kansas Silo Acid Lab by William Picard that they said was the last of the Brotherhood of Love acid lads. And at one point, it dried the world's supply of LSD up by something like 95%. So in somewhere like 2003, 2004, LSD, certainly in North America, looked like it might disappear forever. And the result was that we went and looked at a whole bunch of different other compounds. Well, maybe just plug the computer in here. Hang on. Sorry, on the move. We plugged in we discovered a whole bunch of other compounds, and we went back, there was the reinterest in natural entheogenics. That was when the whole ayahuasca surge started. We started to extract DMT, and there was a lot of interest in Sasha Shulgin's creations from Peake and Takao. You saw 2CB, 2CI, 2CE, dozens and dozens and dozens of other compounds. So you now have young psychonauts that have more experience in all those kind of things than they've never even seen acid. They're just swinging back the other way a bit. So what was interesting was in this attempt to prohibition just resulted in diversification. So that, I think, is one of that, and the internet. The internet's had a huge influence on the global spread of psychedelic culture and of little pockets of psychedelia being able to reach out around the world. It's been great for artists. It's been great for electronic music. The whole interconnectedness nature of the festival scene, like the American festivals and the Australian festivals and the English or the European psytrance festivals, have very different musical tastes, but they all have the same philosophy and kind of the same artistic creations. And when you go to one of these transformational festivals, there's a certain experience you experience. And what's interesting is the music's actually different, but the experience is similar. So it's more about the philosophy and the experience that's drawing this community together rather than any particular singular musical taste, which is quite unusual because usually people go to one, So you now have this sort of global worldwide tribe that's being supported by the transformational festival scene. Burning Man and Boom in Portugal being the two main ones. And we have a whole new, basically all through the 80s, psychedelic information was on lockdown. There was nothing. No books came out. There was everything was negative. LSD affects your chromosomes and your DNA and rah, rah, rah. And then in the early 90s, there was a little break, and there was three authors published very seminal works in my mind, and that was Sasha Shulgin, Alexander Shulgin, and Anne releasing Peake in '93. Terence McKenna released Food of the Gods and the Archaic Revival at about the same time. And Alex Gray's first book, Sacred Mirrors, also came out same year. So in the early 90s, you had these three unknown authors have created a new kind of a structural framework that most of the contemporary psychedelic community has evolved from, rather than the original 60s acid pioneers. That's one quick breakdown.
Wow. Because I really enjoyed reading it. And again, it's incentivized me to revisit this, because the whole thing, the way in which psychedelics, as you rightly say, it seems to be that it's almost a facilitation that's taking place with all of us at the moment, whereby you and I can now be in contact, and I can be in contact with so many people from around the world, and we can share the ideas and we can bounce off each other. And it's so powerful at the moment. So in terms of human evolution, and that sounds such a grand term, but I think in many ways, I think we are in this crisis level in terms of humanity and its relationship with the planet. So what do you think the promise for psychedelics for the future is? Where is it going to take us? What do you think is the outcome of this? I know it's incredibly teleological to say so, but what is the future of humanity, taking into account your analysis of our relationship with 5-MeO and the touching of the numinous that it facilitates?
Well, looking at where we're at the moment, it's pretty grim. I got to say that I've lost a lot of the optimism that I had 10 years ago. But I'm also, you have to appreciate the ingenuity of the human species and our ability to really change quite quickly. And it's true, we only need something like 3% of the population to radically change our trajectory. I definitely think psychedelics and entheogens have reappeared at this point in human history to try and reconnect us with nature, with source, God, whatever you want to call it. But the universe is calling out to us hey, crazy monkeys, you're about to go off the ledge, and we're just trying to get back in touch, right? Because even if you look at the environmental movement, so much of that came out of the psychedelic experiences of the 60s. And that this idea of this interconnectedness, and now our sciences and everything keep showing us how interconnected everything really is. And the psychedelic experience is one of the easiest ways to feel that, to actually touch something that's more theoretical until you have one of these experiences. So I honestly think the only chance humanity has is to adopt an entheogenic perspective. a psychedelic perspective, to take the lessons that psychedelics, synthetic and plant-based, are telling us, whether that's just they're affecting our own common sense, or they're bringing us back to some sort of like archetypical ideas, or if they really do just show us a better way of living, I think doesn't really matter. What we need tools to bring us back into balance. And what's interesting to me after many years of psychedelic culture is most people that are deeply involved in psychedelic culture healthily are very balanced. You need to be fairly healthy and balanced to have to maintain a psychedelic component in your life, whether it's once a month or 2-3 times a year or whatever. Psychedelics will show you what's wrong with your life really quickly if you don't have your shit together. So most people that integrate them well into their lives have pretty good lives. There's always abusers. There's always going to be something like that. But I look at a lot of other things in our, like alcohol, for example, and I don't see the same beneficial aspect. And I certainly don't popular drugs like cocaine. To me, they're the exact opposite. But a healthy psychedelic regime generally results in a healthy human being. So we need a psychedelic perspective to our entire society to convert to a healthy perspective. Now, whether that happens this time around or whether it happens next time around is probably the big question. I think we're in a race against our own ingenuity at the moment. And it's going to be fascinating to see where it all goes. I have no clue.
Well, one of the things that we touched upon earlier about breaking convention, and I can honestly say that that's an event where I meet the nicest people ever. And it's a long weekend where, there's around about 1,000 delegates and everything else. And it's such a meeting of minds. And I can imagine it's probably similar to the feelings that maybe the festivals in the late 1960s, like Woodstock maybe, and things, the same kind of feeling of everybody's there for the same reasons, for the same purposes. And they're there to learn. There's this great wanting to understand and wanting to learn. Now, one of the things that in my latest book, The Hidden Universe, one of the things I discuss is encounters with entities in altered states of consciousness, such as DMT and similar substances. Have you ever been in the position where you have interfaced? The reason I'm asking is that there are associates of mine that you're probably aware there's this research going on at Imperial College in London.
Yeah, I was at one of the Turingham retreats.
I'm sorry?
I was invited to one of the Turingham retreats. I was at the
Oh,
one
were you?
Oh,
right. And how did you find that? It's an opportunity to talk about that. How was that?
It was great. We had this crazy, basically myself, Dennis McKenna, Graham Hancock, Roland Griffith, all kinds of people got invited to Alex and Alison Gray's retreat center in upstate New York. I was supposed to go to one of the ones in Turingham, and I had a visa issue. I got turned, they wouldn't let me on the plane. So I missed it. So luckily I got invited to this third one. It was great. I like what those guys are trying to do. I'm more impressed with the default network node stuff and the things that's going on with the Imperial College, David Nutt's group, Robin Carthart.
Hagar Harris, yeah.
Yeah, he was great. He was at this retreat too. I think that stuff's great. I got to say, amongst some of us, the whole entity thing was just a bit of a joke.
That's interesting.
Because I don't know, entities don't really appear in my psychedelic, in my models. And usually when they do, they're kind of more of an aberration of consciousness other than anything else. But those guys needed a specific experiment, and they wanted something to go looking for, and that's obviously their particular personal interest. So let's find out what they find out.
Well, what you could expand from there is to say that if if consciousness is singular and effectively we are kind of emanations of this greater consciousness, the entity encounters are actually linked in some way at a much deeper level with our own psychological, our own psyche and everything else as well.
Yeah, they're more archetypical.
Yeah, I agree.
And the one time I've ever encountered an entity per se was the first time that DMT really worked on me well. And I was in Panama, and we're out in the jungle on the roof of my buddy's house. And I'd just given 3 people 5-MeO DMT, and I ran out. I didn't have any for myself. So I decided I would try DMT, and DMT doesn't work very well. I mean, I knock it out too easily. I usually need to be on an LSD to start, and I need weed, and my whole thing with DMT is very weird, very strange.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think DMT?
Well, Bruce Damer, who's the NASA biophysicist and a mainstay on the American psychedelic scene, one of the smartest cats I know, his theory, because he's the same way. For example, neither Bruce and I, vaporization of DMT does not work on us at all, right? And I've had so many DMT chemists don't believe me, and they're like, oh, you're just not doing it with the right rig, and they have all these crazy rigs, and they can literally, I've seen guys put a ball of DMT, like a gram, in their rigs, and me smoke it, and puff it down, and puff it down, and puff it down, and it just gets smaller and smaller, and finally I'm like, I feel really bad about smoking all your guys' DMT, and they look at me and they're like, you can talk? Like, they just can't believe that I'm still completely present and it's done nothing, right? So Bruce Damer, who's a very smart gentleman, his theory is that high IQ people have particularly strong blood-brain barrier defenses. We have these serotonin towers that surround our brain, and apparently if you're high IQ, your defenses are extremely strong.
Interesting.
And the only way that DMT works for me is if I smoke weed with it, or first, and then that knocks out the defenses, and the DMT comes through the breach. Now, the one time I had lunch with Alexander Shulgin at the MAPS conference, first MAPS conference, before he had his stroke. And, you know, when you talk about Tryptamine Palace, I just feel extraordinarily grateful that I've got to meet people like Sasha and Nick Sand, and for a country boy from New Zealand to have met and had conversations with some of the great minds I've had. It's just gives me the chills just thinking about it. But anyway, with this lunch with Sasha, I asked him the question. I was like, look, why is 5-MeO DMT more powerful than DMT? Right? And he goes, well, you know, the oxygen is on the methoxy's in the 5th position. I'm like, yeah, I know that. I said, but why? Right? And he laughed. And he goes, oh, no one's ever asked me that. So Alexander Shulgin's explanation to me, I'm no chemist, was that DMT is very fragile. It's like a snowflake, and it's super easy to destroy. When you add the extra methoxy group, it stiffened the whole molecule up. And he said it makes it like a little dart, was the way he explained it. So even with a much less amount, the 5-MeO molecule, because it's stiffer, just whizzes through the blood-brain barrier, whereas DMT hits it and gets destroyed. Now, if you take acid, it works even better, DMT, or psilocybin. Nick Sand swore by God that 6 hours into an LSD trip was the time to smoke DMT. And he was the guru, right? He said that's the time. Now, if you think about it, same thing's happening, right? The acid is also working on your blood-brain barrier, so it's overpowering it. So the DMT has more of a chance to come through. And my talks, I ask this question all the time, like, how many people smoke DMT? And everybody puts their hand up. Like, how many people has it not worked? And a good 20% leave their hands up. And I go, try it with weed, if you smoke weed. Terence McKenna used to smoke like 2 big joints before he'd do his DMT, is what I've been told. He was a big believer in it. And it's funny because the classical literature says don't mix pot and DMT. But in my experience, if DMT is not working that great for you, try that. Tell me what you think. Yeah.
Wow, that was priceless. That was absolutely priceless. That kind of I love the dart analogy, and you know, you're rather like myself. I mean, I find that, you know, being this working class kid from Liverpool, and I'm interfacing with all these people, it's the same kind of feeling of awe and excitement because you want to suck all the information out of them. And I think, you know, the last hour has been absolutely fascinating talking to you. I think we've just scratched the surface. We haven't even started getting into anything really deep, which I think we obviously will be doing. I think Dia and I have discussed many times, my producer over there in Colorado, that we've got so many guests now, we're ready to come back with them, and also ready to facilitate some kind of either online conference or some kind of conference somewhere, because we have such great minds that are now building up, and the back catalogue we've got now of people is just phenomenal. I mean, I've just noticed now, because I'm on Facebook, and I've just noticed David Luke has just replied to, just commented on the Tryptamine Palace coincidence, which is really nice. So it's really good that we've got a lot of people listening in. Also to say that this is only the second time we've gone out live on Facebook Live, and there's so much activity going on, because I keep looking up and checking with my phone and with the activity, but there's so much happening there at the moment. This has proved to be an incredibly popular interview. Now, in terms of anybody wants to contact you, wants to know about your work and everything, how do they contact you? Where are you active on the web and everything else as well?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked me that. I'm probably the mystery man because I'm like the world's worst networker.
I'd heard that.
I'm trying really hard to get off Facebook this year. Like, you can find me on Facebook, but I'm over it as a social platform.
Good idea. Yeah.
I'm close to having my own website, which will be jamesoroc.com, which is going to have a blog, eventually, hopefully, some podcasts, and it'll pull together my photography and my writing and a bunch of other aspects of the things that I do. And yeah, I mean, James Oroc at Gmail, just my name, works fine too. I do have a new book coming out. It's my first book of fiction, Under the Influence, 20 tales of psychedelic noir and other assorted writings. They're kind of like little drug dealing tales gone wrong, kind of tales from the dark side. Most people think they're pretty funny, so I'll be curious to see what people think about that.
So when will that be out?
It's going to be out in the next couple of months. We're finishing up the cover in that right now, so
wow,
it's done.
Much needed, I think. You know, we do need to write about these things in another way, as well as actual non-fiction, but in many ways it lends itself to fiction, and it's the
I primarily consider myself a fiction writer. Like, I would far rather be writing novels and short stories than footnotes.
Yeah, people, you can't be picked up on your fiction. You can go anywhere with it, but everybody's checking the nth degree that you've got the right thing correct. You know, been there, got the brownie point. Okay, James, absolutely, thank you so much for being involved.
My pleasure. It's been fun.
It's been great. It's really been great. So we must stay in touch. Let's stay in touch on with various contacts we can have as well. There's other things I want to talk to you about as well. And as always, thanks for Dia Nunez out there in a very snowy Colorado. So thank you again. And for everybody that was listening live on Facebook Live, thank you very much, guys. This seems to be a very successful way of doing this. Unfortunately, we cannot see the guest, but you can hear the guest, which is good. But this will be the interview. You will see the beautiful James Oroc on YouTube when it goes up on YouTube as well. So you can see both of us interfacing as well. Okay, until next time, thank you very much, and have a wonderful rest of your weekend, if we're not all blown away in this this wild and wonderful country we live in as well. Okay, thanks, guys, and thanks, James. Thank you.
My pleasure.